10 unnerving True Park Ranger reports from Summer Nights in the Woods. Horror Stories Story 1. The footsteps that matched mine. You can tell when a sound belongs to something with a mind. A raccoon will scrabble without rhythm. A buck will crash and then stand, holding its breath along with you. But a person, whether they mean to or not, falls into your pace. That night, the sky was the color of cold ash, and the moon kept slipping behind ragged clouds. And every time my boots sank into the soft mat of needles, a second step followed half a breath later. Not louder, not softer, not rushing, just there. I was on the back trail that skirts the old burn scar, a quiet cut of earth where the hemlocks thin into laurel and the ground falls away toward the creek. My light made a tunnel in the fog, a pale cylinder I carried around like a fragile glass. I kept the beam low, watching for copperhead shapes and broken branches, and I told myself what I always tell myself. You've walked this loop 100 times. The woods keep their own counsel. Don't invent trouble. I stopped. The forest closed in around the sudden hush, like a hand cupped over a mouth. The seconds stretched and thinned. Somewhere deeper in, a barred owl tested a question and didn't wait for an answer. Then, from behind me and slightly to my left, another step, the exact weight and rhythm of mine, coming a hair late, as if the sound had to travel farther than the distance to my own boot. I swept the light through the saplings, slow, making myself take the extra breath before each move the way they taught us, and all I found were wet leaves laid down shiny and dark, a single fern frond bowed with dew. No eyeshine, no shape. I said, "Park service," because sometimes the word is enough to make a drunk teenager stand up and try for innocent. The syllables vanished between the trunks. It felt wrong to talk, like speaking in a church when you don't belong there. I started again, and the step started again, patient as a metronome. I didn't run. Running in the dark is how you break an ankle, and the nearest road was still 15 minutes west through a mess of blowdowns. I shortened my stride and listened. The copycat shortened too, just enough that the space between us didn't close. I tried an old trick. I let my heel touch, and then rolled slowly forward, making a long whisper instead of a crisp crunch. The answering sound stretched with mine, that same whisper on the same delay. The thoughts slid into my head without my permission. Either someone was right behind me being careful, or I was listening to the echo of myself off something big and close, a wall of rock maybe, though I knew that stretch and there's no cliff face near the scar. I turned my light to the ground and checked the path. My prints were clear, tread pattern I'd know anywhere, the little nick in the outside heel where I'd caught a nail last spring, and beside them in places where the duff took a deeper impression. There were not 2 sets, but 3, mine fresh, and under them older ones. Same tread, same nick, as if I'd already been here tonight and walked out ahead of myself. The radio on my shoulder cracked with a burst of static that sounded like cold rain on aluminum. "Ranger 2, you clear?" It was dispatch, but the timing made me jump. My finger jabbed the transmit and slipped off. I tried again. "2, I'm good." On the burn scar cut, moving west. Silence. Then my own words came back, thin and damp. Not from the radio, but from the trees to my left, as if a mouth 20 yards off had learned my shape and was trying it on. The hair at the base of my neck prickled like frost forming. I kept moving. I thought about the missing hiker we never found 3 summers ago when the creek flooded, about the man who camped in the group site without a permit and left fish heads nailed to the bulletin board in neat spirals, about how night makes ordinary people behave like their shadows are in charge. There's a narrow choke point on that trail where laurel branches knit so close you have to duck. I reached it without realizing, and when the slick leaves brushed my cheek, the sound behind me stopped completely. The sudden lack of it was worse than the presence had been. like a song cutting off mid-note. I crouched through, stood up on the other side, and angled my light back. The tunnel of Laurel was a dark throat. A small thread of fog moved through it like exhale. I waited. I could hear my own pulse now, a soft thud behind the cartilage of my ear. I told myself to count to 10 and then to 20. On 21, a single step sounded in the tunnel, closed this time, and something small fell from the leaves, hit the path, and rolled into the beam. It was a pebble, the smooth grey kind from the creek bed, damp, with a crescent of lighter stone along one side like a fingernail. I didn't touch it. I backed up and moved on. The forest didn't encourage questions. The air changed when I hit the flats, warmer but thicker, like walking into someone else's breath. The service road was close now. I could smell the dust that always hangs there, a tired, dry scent like old books. I convinced myself it was just a trespasser playing games because it's easier to think a person wants to scare you than to consider they don't care if you're scared or not. At the last bend, I killed my light and let my eyes open wide so the lot lamps wouldn't blind me when I broke out of the trees. In the dark, the steps behind me returned, unhurried, sure, each one landing a half heartbeat after mine. I pictured a man in a dark coat walking barefoot to make that soft sound, heel then toe, copying me for the pleasure of it. The road's gravel glinted ahead, a strip of dull silver. I stepped onto it and everything under my boots shifted and sang the way gravel does, a thin chorus of clinks and scrapes. The echo behind me did the same, only the clinks didn't match. They were smaller. throws a tight white cone that shifts with the wearer's breath. This was different. It wasn't the quick blink of a hiker's LED or the wandering sway of someone looking for a dropped key. It was warm and steady, a small amber heart deep in the pines that didn't move when I did and didn't belong where it was. It was too far in to be a legal site, tucked well past the loop where we keep the numbered pads, beyond where families with coolers go, and into the quiet cut where the ground falls away without warning and the pines own the dark. I took the beam of my flashlight down to my boots, kept it soft to save my night vision, and stepped off the trail the way you do when you've done it too much, edge of the boot on the duff, lift the branches with an open palm so they slide by without snapping, weight low, knee loose. No sense advertising yourself. The slope tipped under me, pine needles laid down thick and damp so they hissed instead of crunching. The smell was the clean, sour pocket after rain, with the iron coin edge the creeks carry when they run low and drag their bellies on rock. I kept the light to the ground and moved toward the glow, and it stayed the same size for a long time, as if the space between us wasn't closing. When the ground flattened and the trees fell back, I stepped into a clearing I didn't know, and that was the first wrong thing. My maps are memorized like hymns. I know where the old burn scar starts to the west, where a blowdown stacks the trunks like pickup sticks, and where the field grass creeps in from the old roadbed. This place wasn't on any of those songs. In the center, a stake had been driven into the soil so deep the earth around it puckered like a mouth. From a crosspiece at the top, an old kerosene lantern hung on a loop of rope. It swayed just enough that the light hopped on the nearest trunks, the flame inside steady, as if the air around it had made its own rules. I stepped closer to the stake. The wood looked fresh cut, sap still beading in tiny amber tears that hadn't had time to crust. Tool marks showed where someone had pared it smooth, draw knife by the look, a few long hooked scrapes where they'd lifted off the grain. The rope was hemp, frayed in places where a person's hand would naturally worry it. I put my nose near the lantern, expecting the bitter old house breath of kerosene or the ghost of a match. Nothing. Only damp earth and something metallic on the back end, faint and clean, like a coin rubbed with a thumb. I took a slow look at the ground. You get good at reading the land's face. If someone had lugged this in, they'd have left sign, a heel cut deeper at the toe, a scuff where the post dragged crushed grass, pointing the direction they'd turned it upright. The grass beneath my boots wasn't trampled. It lay bent outward in a perfect ring around the stake. Every blade bowed away from the center as if a bowl had been pressed upside down and lifted off again. I squatted and passed my fingers above it. No heat rising, no breath of air coming up through a hole. I touched a blade. It sprang back slow, wet, and when I let it go it didn't quite return, just held that polite bend like it had been trained. I said my location for the recorder out of habit. Ranger 2, off trail west of Seven Pines Loop, investigating an unauthorized light source. The radio hissed back like a pan on a burner. No voice, no call sign, just a steady white noise that pushed and ebbed as if it were breathing. I stepped away from the stake and tried again at the edge of the clearing. Same breath, same rise and fall, no words riding on it. I turned the squelch, nudged the antenna, put the unit up near my face like proximity alone could make it listen better. The lantern kept its little heartbeat. I put my hand close to its glass and felt nothing. It wasn't cold, not exactly. It was absent, as if warmth had never been an option contained inside that shape. I circled once, slow, counting paces, letting my beams slip ahead just enough to make sure I wasn't about to catch a stump with my shin. No tent, no pack, no scrap of wrapper or arc of ash. On the far side where the trees gathered again, I found a notch cut into an old pine at shoulder height, 2 flat bites of a saw making a shallow V, old-timer trail sign, the kind you see on deer runs that eventually harden into footpaths. Only this was fresh too, the wood inside the cut still pearl pale, sap tacky. I lifted my hand and pressed it against the bark above the notch to steady myself, and my palm came away with a whisper of grit. I rubbed my fingers together. Not sawdust. Finer. Ash, maybe, but there was no pit, no char, and when I lifted my hand to my nose, it smelled not like fire, but like a nail pulled from wet wood. I stood there with the radio pressed to my shoulder until the hissing paused long enough for the night sounds to climb back in. The tiny plinks of water gathered and falling from high needles, the threadbare shuffle of a vole, the polite question of an owl too far off to matter. For a breath, I was embarrassed, a grown man in a uniform staring at a lantern as if it had spoken my name. I reached out and steadied it just to feel something solid. The rope rasped against the crosspiece, a small, honest sound among all the others that weren't. A gust moved through the pines and the lantern's flame leaned to one side without guttering. I watched the glass for soot, for any marker of time. It stayed clear as a bottle. When I backed away to leave, the clearing didn't empty from my body all at once. That's the best way I can say it. There are places that let you step out of them. There are places that hold on to you the way a sweater can snag on a nail. The air around the stake felt thicker than the air had a right to be, like a slow river you had to push through. At the edge, where saplings began again to meddle with your thighs, the lantern dimmed, slowly at first, like a person thinking the better of something, then all at once. The light pinched itself down into a dull bead and went out. The dark came in with authority, a pressed black lid over everything. I did the stupid thing and flicked my flashlight on high, which baked my eyes and showed me every drop of water clinging to every needle, and not one thing I wanted to see. I stood blind for a beat, spots floating, and then I walked. Not a hurry, not a jog, just a good straight walk, the way you do when your nerves are trying to invent extra sounds and you refuse to feed them. The radio kept up its gentle ocean noise against my ear. Once, off to my right, a branch moved with a purposeful shiver and then stilled the way something living goes still when it knows you've clocked it. I let my light pass over and away. If I lit eyes, I didn't want to know which shape they were set in. I found the main trail by boot memory. Roots I've tripped on a dozen times warning me with their low humps. The old blaze on a hemlock that looks like a man turning his head to listen. When I hit the loop proper, the bench at the bend came up like a friend. I sat and let the dark fill in the shapes it wanted to make. The radio finally found its voice long enough to bark my call sign. 2, status. Dispatch sounded small and far, like someone speaking from under a heavy quilt. I pressed the mic. Investigated an unauthorized light source. Area appears clear. I meant it, and I didn't. The clearing was a fact. The light had been a fact until it wasn't. The rest was feeling, and feeling doesn't write well in incident logs. I went back the next afternoon with a partner, maps in a bag and a GPS unit we barely trust, because the canopy plays games with satellites and the machines let themselves be fooled. We fought through the same pines and slid down the same slope, and when the ground flattened, I knew before we broke through that we wouldn't find it. We found a low place with fern and 2 wind throws, a game trail, and the notch in the bark was gone like a scab that never was. My partner laughed and asked if I'd found a secret poacher party, lanterns and all. I showed him the circle I couldn't quite point to. He couldn't see it. Maybe it wasn't there. Maybe it was only in my feet, the way the grass remembered being taught to bend. At dusk I parked where the loop widens and listened. I wanted to tell myself it had been a hunter marking a place he didn't want company in, or kids playing with an antique to make a ghost story out of a night. That metallic smell stuck in my throat like old pennies. and when I closed my eyes I saw sap beading on fresh wood and a rope somebody had turned in their hands until the fibers came loose. On the walk out, the trees were polite and the dark behaved, and I thought maybe I'd earned a night off from whatever odd current runs through this place. Then, 100 yards from the truck, the radio breathed and went quiet, and somewhere off trail an amber dot breathed back to life. Not moving, patient, as if it had all night to decide whether it had called me or I had called it. I didn't go to it. I told myself I wouldn't. I told myself that again in the cab with the doors locked and the keys in, and it was still there when I pulled away, steady as a pulse you can't lower just by willing it, waiting in a place my maps don't show. Story 3. The radio check that wasn't. It was a little after 1 in the morning, the kind of hour when the forest feels hollowed out, like everything living has stepped just out of reach. Night patrol is slow work. You settle into the rhythm of it. Every 30 minutes you key your mic, give your location, maybe crack a joke if dispatch is still awake. It keeps you tethered. I was halfway down the East Maintenance Trail, the one that runs parallel to the ridge but never quite climbs it, when I heard my own call sign come back through the static. Only I hadn't touched the mic. The voice was mine, my exact tone, the same clip delivery, even the little clearing of my throat I do without realizing. The hair at my nape rose before my mind had time to process it. I stood in the center of the trail, beam of my flashlight cutting a narrow path ahead, the edges collapsing into black. I listened hard for the hiss that meant dispatch was about to say something else, but the air just waited. Then it came again, my voice, closer this time, though the radio in my hand stayed silent. I tried the mic anyway. 2, copy last. My thumb held the button a little too long, nothing but dead air. Then, from somewhere ahead on the trail, I heard the click of a mic keying up, sharp, mechanical, undeniable, followed by the crunch of boots on gravel. The sound was precise. My boots, same weight, same tread pattern, the familiar 2-beat rhythm I'd heard in my own ears for years. I turned in a slow circle, telling myself I'd find someone standing there with a handheld, grinning at the joke. The forest didn't move. Even the usual leaf talk in the canopy had gone still, as though the night was holding its breath along with me. I started forward, each step deliberate. The crunching sound ahead kept pace, never hurrying, never falling behind. Then I stopped, so did it. Perfectly. I waited, light down low, letting my eyes adjust beyond the beam. I could make out the paler stripe of the trail curving ahead, just trees, just stone. I took 1 step backward, the gravel under my boots spoke. A half second later, behind me, the same sound, too exact to be chance, answered back. A cold damp settled in under my jacket, the kind that makes you feel like you're standing in the mouth of a cave. I keyed my mic again, voice low. 2 to base, confirm. Static broke in over me, but inside it was something else. A murmur, low and distorted, almost words but not enough to catch. It scraped like a tape dragging slow through a recorder, my cadence twisted into something flat and wrong. Up ahead, the trail forked. The left spur led to a decommissioned fire road, the right hooked back toward the lot. I chose right. My boots kept their pace. The other pair followed. The sound of them was close enough now that I could feel it in the bones of the trail, like 2 people walking in sync across a wooden floor. Halfway to the lot, the night shifted. The air picked up the faint tang of iron like wet pennies, and the wind pushed a line of cold across my face that didn't belong to the season. I heard another mic click, this time right in front of me, close enough that I almost raised my light into my own eyes. Then my voice came again, clear and empty, saying my last check-in word for word. Hearing yourself from outside your own body does something to the mind. It untethers you, makes you feel like maybe you've been walking in someone else's shape without knowing it. I stepped forward fast, swinging the light across the trees. They caught the beam in long, flat planes. Trunks, branches, nothing in between. The sound of my double's boots moved too, but now there was a delay, like it was waiting to follow instead of walking alongside. The lot lamps came into view through the trees, a pale promise. I cut my light to save my night vision. The steps behind me kept going in the dark, measured, calm. When I reached the gravel at the lot's edge, mine rang clear against the stones. A beat later, the other pair landed too, lighter this time, as if the weight had shifted. I turned with the flashlight up, sweeping the trail I'd just left. The beam showed empty gravel, tapering into dark. My breathing sounded too loud in my own ears. Then, just before I dropped the light, I caught it. A shadow sliding off the path into the undergrowth, matching my height, my stride, my shape, in the split second it took to vanish. I keyed the mic just to anchor myself. 2, back at lot, all clear. What came back wasn't static or dispatch. It was my voice, not from the radio, but from somewhere in the black behind the tree line, saying the same words I'd just spoken, only a half breath late. I got in the truck and didn't turn my back to the woods until the engine was running. On the drive out, the radio stayed silent, but I kept catching the faint click of a mic over the hum of the tires, like something out there was still trying to keep pace. I tell myself it was an echo or some odd skip in the radio channels, but I've worked these ridges long enough to know the air doesn't throw your own voice back at you unless something else wants you to hear it. Story 4, The Tent at the Wrong Campsite Campground B was supposed to be silent this year. The winter storms had chewed out half the access road, and the Park Service had roped it off with orange mesh and a sagging closed sign that swayed in the wind. Even before the washout, B wasn't popular. Too far from the lake, too many pines packed in tight enough to choke off the breeze. It had that heavy smell of pitch and rot you get when trees grow too close together. I only cut through it on patrol because the old loop connects back to the service trail, and it's quicker than going around the ridge. That night, the air was cold enough to pinch the inside of my nose, and the moon was a dull coin behind thin cloud. I was halfway through the loop when a pale light showed between the trunks, low to the ground, steady but faint, like the last glow in a dying lantern. There shouldn't have been any lights here. No one was supposed to be camping. I angled my flashlight toward it, letting the beam skim the ground so I didn't blind whoever it was. It was a small dome tent, the kind you can set up in 10 minutes, pitched neat on an old gravel pad. The gravel was still outlined by timbers gone soft with rot, and I could see the corners of a faded number painted on one of them. No vehicle nearby, no bikes, no extra gear. Just the tent. I called out, voice low but carrying, "Park Service." Anyone inside? The flap was zipped, but the fabric bowed just enough to suggest someone was sitting cross-legged in there, not moving, not answering. I called again, louder this time. The shape stayed perfectly still. No rustle of sleeping bag, no shift of weight. That's when I noticed the ground. The pine needles around the pad were pressed flat in a perfect ring, radiating outward from the tent like something wide and solid had settled there from above. The kind of even flattening you don't get from footsteps or gear being dragged in. My radio was clipped to my vest, and I reached for it without taking my eyes off the tent. 2 to base. Static answered me, thin and distant. I tried again, but the hiss was all I got. I took one slow step back. The light from inside the tent didn't waver, and the figure didn't so much as breathe. Another step back. My boot found soft soil off the gravel, and the sound of it breaking the surface of old leaves seemed too loud in the stillness. I turned my head just enough to see the trail I'd come from. I didn't want to put my back to it, but instinct told me to start moving. When I turned back, the tent had changed. It hadn't collapsed all the way, but it had slumped in on itself, fabric folding like there was nothing to hold it up from inside. The light was gone. The ring in the pine needles was gone too, flattened 1 second, then as untouched as if no one had stepped there in years. I stood frozen, waiting for my eyes to adjust, for some small noise to explain it. Nothing. The old pad looked like any other abandoned site. The wind moved through the pines, making the high needles shiver in soft waves, but it felt more like a whisper than a breeze. My radio crackled once, no voice, just the brittle pop you get when a signal tries to force its way through. I eased toward the pad again, just enough to see inside the flap. It was still zipped, and the tent was empty. No bedroll, no lantern, not even a stray pebble on the floor. I didn't touch it. I've learned not to. The air smelled faintly metallic, like rain on hot tin, even though the ground was dry and the clouds hadn't thickened. When I finally left, I kept my light down, watching my own boots hit the trail. Every so often, I felt the urge to glance back, but I didn't give in until the loop was almost behind me. The pad was barely visible through the pines. I thought it was empty. Then the light flickered back on, weak and low, and the shape inside sat exactly as it had before, as though I'd never walked away. I called it in from the ridge where the signal was strong. The next morning, I went back with another ranger. The site was empty. The pad was overgrown, timbers crumbling, no sign anyone had been there for years. He laughed and said I'd been seeing things. Maybe I had, but sometimes on night patrol, I still cut through B. I don't go near that pad, but I look for the light between the trees. When I see it, I keep walking. Story 5. The campfire with no heat. The ridge trail was quiet enough that night to make my own breathing sound out of place. The air was sharp and clean, the kind that carries scent farther than you'd expect, but all I could smell was pine and old leaves. I was halfway across the high stretch when the trees opened just enough to let me see a glow down below. It wasn't the flicker of a headlamp or the wandering beam of someone looking for a lost trail. It was orange and steady, pulsing like a heartbeat between the trunks. A fire in a no-burn zone. I muttered to myself and started down, already rehearsing the citation I'd hand out. The closer I got, the more certain I was that it was a big one. Tall flames licking up between stacked logs. cones, like no one had been there in years. Even now, when I walk that ridge at night, I find myself glancing downslope without meaning to. Sometimes I see the glow again, steady between the trees, and I feel that cold slide down the inside of my ribs. I don't go closer anymore. I already know the fire won't burn me. I'm more afraid of what might be keeping it lit. Story 6. The Bridge. That wasn't there yesterday. I keep a mental ledger of this place, where the laurel closes over the trail like a zipper, where the creek floods after a hard hour of rain, where wind puts a permanent lean into the white pines. On the map, it's clean and helpful, all lines and contour, but out here, the forest has its own handwriting. The morning before, I'd walked the upstream loop from main camp and had to rock hop the creek where the old stepping stones sit like teeth. I remember it because I slipped, even with good tread, and filled my boot to the arch. That's the kind of detail your foot doesn't let you forget. So the next night, with the light gone silver behind the ridge and the mosquitoes coming up from the low places, I headed the same way to check on a call about a downed limb across the trail. The forest had that tired, humid quiet, the kind that makes you feel like your own footsteps are intrusive. I heard the creek before I saw it, that stretched out, hushed shushing that means it's running high but not angry. My beam snagged white on water and then caught something else, straight lines where there shouldn't be straight lines. A footbridge crossed the creek, not a new aluminum prefab, but old timbers slick with moss, 2 stringers with plank boards that looked hand-sawn, the kind of work you only see on CCC relics or private land. It had a simple handrail on one side made from a peeled sapling, lashed to posts with something dark that soaked the binding like oil. The smell hit me, wet wood and a sweet, old smell like a barn after rain. Trouble was, there hadn't been a bridge here yesterday. No budget, no volunteer notice, nothing in the work log. And a bridge doesn't walk in on its own. I stood with my boot on the first plank and bounced the weight a little. It gave and creaked, the noise loud as a groan in the close air. My light grazed the boards, showing green slick in the grain where moss had made a home. Moss doesn't grow overnight. A trickle of water ticked from the handrail down onto the decking, the drip steady as a second hand. I told myself it was an old crossing I'd somehow missed, that I'd been paying attention to my wet sock and not to the trees framing my way. I'm careful, but I'm not proud. I can be wrong. I took hold of the rail and started across. The wood answered me with every step, that hollow talk of aged timber, but the give had confidence beneath it, as though the bridge had been bearing weight for years. In the middle, the creek ran black and cold, curling itself in a tight rush around a rock like a shoulder. The night pooled in the water where my beam couldn't reach, and something in there, some shadow that didn't belong to any branch or stone, rode the current like a scab. The handrail was slick, and something dark had stained my palm. When I held it near my face, it smelled like wet iron and sap. I wiped it on my pant leg and told myself to move. The far bank rose in a low shelf shaggy with grass and jewelweed. The trail, though, past the bank it frayed into undergrowth, a tangle where there should have been a clear cut through. On the other side, I picked carefully through the first few yards, thinking the footbed was just choked with seasonal growth I'd failed to note in spring. There were signs of passage, fern fronds with broken tips, a scuff in damp leaves where something had turned, one stem of jewelweed bent low enough to drip. Then the sign stopped, and the ground took on that mounded look places get when no one has stepped there in a long time. I turned my light back to the bridge. The beam made a pale ladder across the water, and I counted the boards without thinking, the way a mind counts when it wants to anchor itself in addition. 9 planks. My boots were wet to the midsole now from grass holding the day's rain. I decided to back out and return by the way I'd come. I don't push a line when night's leaning in, not when the creek is between me and the lot. I set my boot on the first plank and felt the familiar give, the bridge answering me. I crossed, steady pace, the rail under my hand a comfort even with its slickness. At the near bank, I paused, turned to look one more time, and the bridge wasn't there. It wasn't half there or collapsed. It was not there. Between the two banks ran fast water, clear enough that my light took it to the stones and showed nothing but river and the shimmer of current. The hand I lifted held air. My boots left wet prints on bare rock where my foot had stepped onto a plank that now was only the thought of a plank. I don't mind telling you that something small and stubborn inside me sat down, hard then, like a mule in a narrow gate. I put the beam wide across the creek, along both banks, searching for cut marks on stumps, for drag grooves in the soil, for anything that would make sense of my bones telling me I'd been somewhere that no longer existed. The smell of old wood had thinned to the normal green of water and crushed weed. The dark binding I'd touched wasn't on my palm anymore. Either I'd wiped it clean without knowing, or it had always just been creek grit and a story my nerves liked too much. I had two choices: bushwhack upstream to the next narrow and risk soaking to the waist, or take the long way down to the footbridge near the camp where the picnic folks like to carve hearts into the rail. The upstream route is faster when you know it, but the banks were steep where I stood, and the night felt like it had its shoulder against my back. I took the long way, following the creek's hiss instead of fighting it, letting my beam dart ahead only when the ground clouded with roots. My breath got loud to me. Every so often I heard another creak that wasn't mine, a timbers in wind sound with no wind to carry it, like wood settling after years of standing still. It came from behind and then from ahead, and once from directly under the water. At the sanctioned bridge, everything was respectable. The aluminum gleamed and the bolts held. My boots clanged hollow and too bright, and a frog leaped from the shadow into the glow like a kid doing a dare. I crossed without looking down. On the far side, the trail that leads back toward where the phantom bridge had been was cleaner than I remembered it, as if maintenance had taken a brush cutter to it that afternoon. We hadn't. We don't cut that stretch until late June. Maybe a volunteer had gotten eager with personal gear. It happens. I picked my way back to the spot I thought I'd used, and there was nothing but water talking to stone. I came back at first light with a partner who thinks he's funny and a thermos of coffee that smelled like saved pennies. Morning made the creek look harmless. We scanned both banks for cut wood. We found no fresh sawdust, no wear marks, only a pair of old CCC abutments farther upstream I'd seen 100 times, and the usual graffiti of raccoon prints. I said nothing about the stain on my palm. My partner told a story about a fisherman who claimed a bridge had moved on him in a flood year, from one bend of the creek to another. He chuckled like the memory tasted sweet. "Water plays tricks," he said, and thumped the thermos against his thigh. What I don't tell many people is that I started counting under my breath that night, out loud, while I was crossing, 1 for each board. 9. I can hear the creak of the 4th plank, the way you can hear an old porch step before you step on it. When I walk that loop now, even in daylight, I catch myself looking for the number 9 in the world. 9 stones aligned in the shallows, 9 cones in a cluster, 9 black knots on a felled trunk. Like if I can find it, I'll find the bridge again in the same breath. Sometimes, near dusk, the air carries that barn-sweet iron touch smell, faint as afterthought, and I know, without seeing, that somewhere between those banks wood is remembering where it once was. I won't tell you that I've seen it since. I won't tell you I haven't. I can tell you that my boots still get wet in that stretch for no good reason, and every so often, in the sound of the creek running like a long whisper, there's another tone under it that's not water at all. A patient timber voice, waiting for a foot to set itself where no plank should be. Story 7. The breath in my ear. Some nights the woods sound hollow, like you could knock on the dark and it would knock back. It was one of those nights. Air holding still. Stars ground fine above the ridge. My headlamp, a narrow lie. I'd cut off the service road to check a strip of orange flagging someone reported, following the contour where the slope loosens before it drops to the creek. Leaf must and a faint iron taste rode the cold. I stopped to check my compass, light in one hand, dial in the other, and felt warm breath touch my ear, not a breeze, the kind of human exhale that moves a stray hair and makes you aware of your own neck. I spun, beam tearing trunks out of the dark like guilty shapes. Nothing. The stillness returned too neatly, like a door eased shut. I told myself it was my own breath bouncing off a tree. Then I heard it again, closer, steady, matched to my exhale but a half beat late, as if someone behind me had learned my rhythm and was practicing. I kept my shoulders loose and moved heel-toe careful over the duff. When you're alone out here, your body remembers old animals. You open your eyes wider, listen with your teeth. The breath kept pace, never touching, never hurrying, always just behind my right cheek, like a person walking beside you without letting their sleeve brush yours. I killed the headlamp and let starlight do the small work. Shapes found edges. A barred owl across the drawer asked its classroom question, then fell quiet like it had remembered something. Park service, I said, because a voice can feel like proof you exist. The word hung heavy and wrong and went nowhere. The breath answered with one of its own, the length of mine but off time, polite, patient. I took the line that would spill me back onto the fire break and from there to the service road. Laurel crowded my thighs, the leaves slick as lids, swallowing light. Every time I caught my boot on a root or put too much weight down, the breath leaned in and stopped, as if the thing behind it was deciding whether to speak. I tried to outpace it, not a run, I know better, but a hard push to heat the jacket. It stayed with me. When I slowed, it eased back into that half-beat delay. At the old locust stump, I know, top polished by years of tired backsides, I paused because I always do. Someone had sat there recently. The wood shone where rough had been worn off. No cigarette butt, no wrapper. The absence of trash felt worse than finding it. I moved on. The dark opened into the old fire break and a thin seam of sky. Through the trees, the lot lamps made a fugitive amber. I adjusted my breathing on purpose, making my exhale jagged so it couldn't match me. It adjusted too. I hated that, being taught like that. 50 yards out, the air in front of me felt crowded, the way it does when you step into a space someone has just walked through. The shadow breath ticked closer, not touching, and I heard the tiniest catch in it. Savaba, cough-sized hitch that put a splinter of cold under my ribs. I stopped. It stopped. The lot lights lined up like small rooms waiting. The service road met my boots with its tired gravel song, signing me in under the first lamp where moths ruin themselves on warm glass. I turned and lifted the beam because you can only refuse to look for so long. Trees, needles, a moth tumbling, the breath cut off clean, not fading, gone, like a valve had closed. I keyed my radio and gave a normal report in a normal voice. The kind you could play back later without hearing the tremor. On the drive out, I cracked the window and let the cold scour the warmth off my skin. I told myself it had been acoustics, trunks and hollows throwing my exhale back wrong. I believed that almost long enough. 2 nights later, I walked the same cut at dusk. No wind. The owl resumed its lesson. I hadn't said a word, not even a sigh. Still, When I paused by that locust stump, hair along my jaw lifted before my mind caught up, and the woods exhaled against my ear, warm as a mouth, then went very still to hear how I would breathe next. Story 8. The Silent Group on the Shore Lake Patrol. After dark is easy to mistake for peace. The motor hums soft enough to pass for a lullaby. The water slaps the hull in a rhythm you start counting without knowing it. And the air lays cool on your face so you think you're awake when really you're sinking into the same soft place the lake sleeps in. I was running the long arc along the far shore where the pines lean out and try to see themselves when I saw them, figures standing knee-deep in the shallows, spaced out like fence posts facing the open water. My first thought was swimmers where they shouldn't be. I thumbed the spotlight up and the white cone rushed across the surface, tearing a bright path to the shore. Nothing, just reeds, a mud lip, the silver backs of stones. I killed the beam and the dark settled back over everything, and there they were again, exactly where I'd seen them. Shapes darker than the water, each one still enough to make you hold your breath in sympathy. I eased the throttle down to a low idle and let the bow drift a little closer, not enough to ground, just enough to hear what the night was doing on shore. Sometimes it's kids daring each other, sometimes it's fishermen poaching in waders and pretending not to hear. I called out, "Park service," a voice that usually changes a posture or breaks a smile. The figures didn't twitch, their reflections were wrong in a way I couldn't place. The ripples off my hull moved out and should have cut the silhouettes into pieces on the water, but the dark shapes stayed whole while the lake around them shivered. I raised the light again, slower, fanning it left to right so I didn't blind anybody if they were hiding in brush. Empty shore. The beam made the reeds look like wire and gave the mud a hard glaze. I thumbed it off and the night poured in and put the figures back in their places. I counted them because counting is a way to keep panic organized. 7, no, 8, because the one nearest the point had been half a thought before it was a shape. I tried again. 8. I kept 8 in my mouth so it couldn't change. The motor ticked under my feet, steady. I drifted close enough to hear the little insect sounds that stitch the shoreline together, but not close enough to hear anything like breath. "You folks okay?" I said, and the lake handed the words back to me too softly for them to be useful. I took the boat hook out and laid it on the gunwale because something in me wanted to have a longer arm than I was born with. My phone in my pocket was a hot rectangle against my leg. I took it out, thumbed the camera, held the screen high. The picture showed the smear of the far trees and the coin of the partial moon and the water like dark glass. No figures. I dropped the phone down so the screen went black, and in the glass of it I could see the silhouettes again, small and perfect, and not bothered by being carried in my hand. I put the phone away. I don't like fighting a thing on that level. I tried the spotlight one more time, and the empty, ordinary shore rushed up at me, off, and the 8 returned. The nearest one now a step farther out, like the water had breathed it gently toward me. The hum of the motor felt louder, like it was covering up something I needed to hear. I twisted the throttle to dead quiet. The lake went from moving song to held breath, every tiny lap against the aluminum sounding like a choice. From the shore, a single sound came, a soft, quick lift, like a foot deciding against stepping. I don't go in where I can't see bottom. That's a rule I say out loud sometimes just to keep it true. I rested my hand on the key and kept it there, the metal cool and simple and human. "If you're in distress, call out," I said, and the nearest silhouette swayed very slightly as if the water had found its knee. I pictured old posts from a drowned fence line exposed in low water and felt relief start to take shape, a story I could bring back that made sense. Then my eyes found the actual posts downshore, a line of 3 leaning together, all half rotted and pale. These 8 were not those. I trimmed the motor up a shade and the prop stirred a little silt. The nearest figure should have broken then, should have torn in the current. It didn't. Instead, the reflections stretched under them like anchors, unbroken and heavy, not an image of the air but something laid into the water itself. I backed the boat a hair, and the shapes did not diminish. They didn't advance either. They only waited, as if my moving or not moving were both acceptable, as long as I did it the way they were ready for. I started the motor because silence felt like permission. The engine coughed and settled into its small heart. I turned the bow toward the main channel and kept my eyes on the figures as long as I could without hitting anything. The spotlight stayed down. At a certain angle they were gone. Water, reeds, mud, and the lake looked like lakes do at midnight. But when I rounded the last bend and the dock lights painted a thin road across the surface, I looked back just once, because I've learned you pay either way. The far shore was ordinary. In the path of the dock lights, my wake broke into small waves. For one slow second in each trough between crests, 8 darker ovals rode the low places, patient as old faces seen through glass. And then the water smoothed the message out and asked me to forget. I tied up and did my paperwork like you're supposed to, words in boxes that don't have a space for what water can hold, and I drove home in a silence that wasn't empty at all. Story 9. The Locked Cabin. With the light on the supply cabin sits just off the service road, where the pine's thin enough to pretend at a clearing, a squat box with a sagging porch and a padlock so old the brand name is rubbed smooth. We keep tools and spare mantles in there, no power, no reason for anyone to be inside after dark. I was cutting through on patrol when I saw it, warm yellow leaking from the cracks around the door. The kind of light a wick makes, soft on wood, steady as a held breath. The lock hung where it always did, dull and heavy, shackled tight in the hasp. I killed my flashlight and let my eyes work. The glow held. I circled slow. One window on the north side, one on the west. Both showed me only my own face and the faint shadow of trees. When I set a boot on the first porch board, the whole cabin seemed to listen, and then the light snapped off clean, not a flicker, just gone. What slipped out to meet me smelled like struck matches and wet iron, even though the night was dry and dust lay in the porch corners like old sugar. I rattled the lock, because that's what you do when you want to prove something to yourself. It answered with the same tired clink it gives in July. The radio on my shoulder hissed when I keyed it. 2 at supply cabin, I said, and the words felt wrong in the air, too loud for a place that small. I knelt to peer under the door. The thin line fraction off, too low and too thick for the road. I turned without moving forward. My beam found bark, leaf, moth. The ticks settled in like a patient conversation I hadn't agreed to join. "Anyone back there?" I called, practicing calm. Between pings, I heard a cab's small privacies, the elastic sigh of a seatback, the faint click a dome light makes when it gives up its heat. I took 5 steps toward the laurel, the 5th one that commits you, and swept the beam slow. No path, no bumper gap, no crushed stems. The wrong engine faded like a hand cupped over a watch. I walked the lot's edge because ordinary motions keep the mind from breaking its own rules. My tread matched my old prints. The gravel offered nothing but obvious truth. The radio sulked with static until I said my call sign twice, and dispatch came back muffled as if speaking through wet cloth. The ticks resumed behind the trees, a half measure behind my truck's last cooling note. I chose the cab because doors and glass feel like decisions. Inside smelled of damp canvas and coffee turning mean. I wrote what I could stand to read later. Shortcut, unnamed road, returned early, and skipped the part where the lot felt like a pocket I wasn't meant to enter from this angle. Before leaving, I took the light to the spot where the ruts should meet the gravel. Everything familiar was there. The ditch, the grasping root, the little anthill I'd scuffed that morning, but no mouth of road. Only laurel arranged into the shape of refusal. My truck ticked once more and fell silent. From the trees, the other engine answered with a single stubborn ping and quit. On the drive out, the headlights made the service lot sign a bright lie for a heartbeat. I watched the mirror longer than was smart, letting the pines fold shut behind me. Just before the last sliver of lot disappeared, a small blue light bloomed beyond the tree line and blinked off. The color a dome light makes when a cold hand opens a door and changes its mind. Since then, some nights I take that way on purpose and never find it. Other nights I stand by my truck, listen for metal keeping time, and count one tick that isn't mine answering from the trees, polite and patient, like it's waiting for me to step into the laurel and let the cadences finally match.